Our plan for this evening. Last week, if you were able to join us, we addressed these first 3 bullet points. We talked about why do we keep records, what do we want to keep, and what do we have. Tonight, we're going to address 2 big questions. How do we preserve and store records, and how do we access and promote records? Last week had a little bit of background in theory, and then we got into some more practical matters. Tonight, the bulk of it is going to be a little more practical. We'll stop a few times through the evening for questions, as I mentioned, so please jot them down anytime they come to you right in that comment box, and we will get them answered as best we can. Let's dive in. How do we preserve and store records? This is one of the big questions that we as archivists encounter a lot. How do we best care for this stuff? How do we make sure that it lasts for the long term? There are 2 chief considerations here, and we're going to address both of them. Those are the environment in which you store your records and the materials in which you store those records. So whether that's boxes or albums of some kind, whatever the physical material is that is housing your documents and other records. Let's talk about environment first. We're talking about environment first, chiefly because if you have a really good environment, if you're able to maintain an ideal environment for your records, then your supplies matter less. Vice versa, if you are not able to maintain a good environment, sometimes it just isn't possible, then those materials are going to matter more. So these really in some ways are 2 sides of a coin. That ideal environment that you're shooting for is one that has these qualifications on it. Ideally, it will be dry, dark, clean, and secure. So dry, you obviously don't want something that has water dripping from the ceiling, but you also don't want something that has a lot of humidity in the air, something that's in a basement or in an attic where you aren't able to control that moisture level as well. Somewhere where you'd have to run a dehumidifier just for your own comfort is probably not an ideal place for your records. Likewise, dark is good. Obviously, you're going to want to be able to see your records, but light can damage them. So if it's possible to have a room without windows or a room where you're able to turn the lights on and off versus somewhere where they're on whenever the building's open, for instance, that would be ideal. Clean probably goes without saying. But dirt, of course, can damage our records. Dirt can also attract other things that can damage the records. So you don't want to have food residue, for instance, or crumbs that might attract pests or other problems. And then finally, you want it to be secure. These are valuable, important records of your organization, and you want to make sure that they're going to still be there when you come looking for them. If possible, a climate-controlled space is best. This would mean somewhere that has air conditioning in the summer and heat in the winter. The goal is really to avoid big temperature swings, to keep things as close to that steady temperature as is possible. And we'll talk a little bit about what temperature ideally that would be for some different kinds of materials. But as long as you can keep it fairly constant, that's the goal. Again, that helps both the temperature and it helps that humidity issue. You want to keep it so that it isn't getting too sticky and it also isn't getting too dry. Shelves. Shelves are very important for your records. Ideally, these will be metal shelves. Wood shelves can give off some gases, and slowly, because wood is that organic material, it can give off some material that can in the long run be damaging to your records. If wood is what you have, that's fine. By all means, shelves are better than no shelves, but if you're in a position to purchase shelving, metal would be the ideal choice. This image here is a little bit less than ideal in several ways you're probably noticing. One is that there's shelving here, but the boxes are stacked on top of each other on top of the shelves. If possible, we like to avoid that because then it will destroy your boxes over time. It will push them down. If you've ever tried to stack more than a couple boxes, you know what I mean. The bottom ones don't come out of it looking so good. And of course, if they get too squished, that will squish whatever is inside of them. So preferably just one box per shelf and preferably on metal shelves. Briefly, we already touched on this, but think about what might be some good spaces in your home, in your office, in whatever spaces are available to you, and think holistically about the space. Are you aware of having pests in there in the past? Is it somewhere that routinely gets ants, for instance? If so, probably not the best place to store your records. Think about where those windows are. How can you minimize that natural light? But also think about what are the systems within your building? Where are your heat vents? Are you going to be putting some more fragile records directly beneath or directly above a heating vent? That would be something you'd want to avoid. Likewise, and probably even more importantly, where are your water pipes and your sprinklers? And have you had any problems with them leaking in the past? If so, you might need to do some extra precautions. Think about ways that you can sheet things or ways that you can move things away from your water pipes as much as possible, whatever that may look like with the spaces that you're given. I mean, most of us aren't in the position to build entirely new rooms for our records, so we have to work with what we have. But these are a few things that we can at least be aware of and therefore mitigate to the best of our ability. Getting a little bit more specific then on the environment, I'm going to break this down into two groups. First, we're going to talk about paper records. Paper records ideally like a temperature between about 35 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relative humidity, that's what that RH on the slide is there, a relative humidity between about 35 and 50%. This is kind of, I sometimes call it a Goldilocks environment. It's not too anything. It's not too warm. It's not too cold. It's not too moist. It's not too dry. It's a pretty middle of the road environment. Generally speaking, if your room is comfortable for you as a person, it will be fairly comfortable for your paper records. They like things a little bit cooler than we normally do. But if you can keep an atmosphere, an environment that isn't fluctuating too much and in which you are fairly comfortable, that will be pretty good for your records. Places you probably want to avoid, and this goes for all record types, are attics and basements to the extent possible, because they generally don't avoid these fluctuations. Those are the places in most of our buildings, especially in Minnesota, where they're going to fluctuate a lot more. So if you can keep things on a main level, in a closet or some space you have on your main level, that's going to be a happier environment for your paper records. AV and photos. I have broken these sorts of materials out because they are generally pickier than your paper records. Photos, negatives, film, videotape, cassette tape, these sorts of records are going to deteriorate more quickly over time. And deterioration for these kinds of records can be worse than deterioration for your paper records. The reason being, if your paper records deteriorate a little bit, say they even get a little bit wet or they get a little bit brittle, you're probably still going to be able to read them. If you end up with a paper clip on one that gets a little rusty because it's been a little bit too moist in the environment, you're probably still going to be able to read the majority of the document. This isn't the end of the world. It's not what we want, but it's something that can be accommodated and you can still retrieve the information. With AV and with photos, this may not be the case. They may deteriorate to a point where you can't read them anymore. This is especially true with film and with tape. They can deteriorate to the point where a machine won't be able to read them anymore and you would need a machine to read most of these, or where they just become so distorted that you can't make out what the image is anymore. And it could be a total loss. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Generally speaking, AV and photos prefer a cooler environment than paper records. This is pretty vague on purpose. Different formats prefer different environments. There are a lot of guides to ideal preservation environments for different record types. I have linked to one here from the University of Illinois that I think is especially user-friendly. It has a lot of good information, and it also helps to identify the type of material you're dealing with. So if you're not quite sure what the thing is that you're looking at, especially if it's an older format, an unfamiliar format, this resource can help you identify it. It can also then tell you some tips for how best to store it. So I'm actually going to follow this link and we'll take a look at it because I think it's an especially good one. While I'm getting this open here, does anyone have a audiovisual or photograph format that they're trying to figure out what to do with, one that we could use as an example? So feel free to type it in the chat.
Well, I've got a question, Jenna, regarding photographs. What should we use to place in between the photos to protect one from the other?
This is a good question, and we will get to this when we get to our materials section. There are a lot of different answers to that, but we will get to there and we'll give you some answers. I've got a slide that deals with that. If we don't answer that question entirely, though, ask it, bring it back up. We'll follow that up. Well, I am going to, so I'm sorry to push off the photo question, but we will come back to it.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, this is Beverly. I was wondering about the audio tapes. We talked about me having a big box of them from the 70s and 80s, and I'm trying to figure out what the best way is to preserve them.
Wonderful example, Beverly. Let's look at audio tapes. Now, are these audio cassette tapes?
I have cassettes, but I also have like home movies in the VHS. Not so many of those, but mostly cassettes, audio.
Okay, great. Let's use that as an example. So this is that resource I was talking about from the University of Illinois. And you'll see they've got it broken down into a variety of different formats. So we've got film, we've got audio tape, which we're going to come back to. We've got videotape, phonograph records, optical media. If you happen to have wax cylinders in your collection, they even have information on that, in addition to paper records, a big variety of paper records. But let's look at these audio cassettes.
Okay.
So you see here we've got a couple different kinds of cassettes. We've got, or of tape. We've got open reels of tape, and then we've got cassettes of different kinds. They're saying 8-track, compact, cassette, all of these different varieties of cassette. If you're not quite sure what you have, you can always just click in. So I don't think we're talking 8 tracks. I'm guessing we're talking about what they're calling a compact cassette. And yep, sure enough.
Yep, I have both.
Oh, okay, interesting. So here we're seeing some of these more familiar cassette tapes from the 70s to the 90s, 2000s. If you're trying to identify what you've got, they're going to give you some good pictures of them here. And they're going to say it's also called this, what I called it a minute ago, right? A cassette tape. They're going to give you dates of when this was in use. This can be especially helpful if you're trying to identify what something is. If you know it was created in 1950, then it isn't going to be one of these, right? Because they didn't exist yet. Okay. It's going to give you a nice description of what the material is. It's going to give you some description of what it's made out of. But what's especially important for us right now is it's going to tell you some of the key deterioration, that's possible with this format. So for audio cassette tapes that are made out of a magnetic tape, that's the tape that they are composed of, it says they're susceptible to physical, biological, and chemical risks like stretching, breaking, dropouts, improper wind, mold, all sorts of things. That they're also prone to stretching and breaking, and that frequent playback wears on them. So these are some of the things that can happen. Then what it's calling this risk level is really how worried do you have to be about these things? Is it something you need to deal with now? Is it something that maybe you can put on the back burner for a little while? What do they think? And they're saying here that a cassette tape can kind of live to a variety of different lengths depending on different things. You'll notice one of those key things they're pointing out is the environment, that if you're able to keep it in somewhere that isn't hot, dusty, and humid, it's going to last longer. One other thing that I'm thinking they say on here somewhere, but maybe I'm missing it, is that cassette tapes are slowly becoming obsolete. We don't have as many cassette players as we used to. So that in and of itself is kind of a problem with this format. Right? Fewer players, more difficult to access the material. Another section I want to point out here that really fits into what we were just discussing is it's going to tell you this ideal storage environment. So it's got the temperature here that cassette tapes like. They want to be somewhere between 40 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit. So a little cooler, like we were talking about in those paper records. And they want a relative humidity between 30 and 50. So that's about the same as the paper records, but they want it cooler, noticeably cooler. It's also going to talk about the storage environment for these cassette tapes. And this is something we'll circle back to in a minute when we're talking about those photo storage options as well. But you'll see that they want some kind of good archival storage containers here, preferably kind of a nice archival plastic. But you want it to be really clean. That's important. You want it to have a container, and you want that container to be clean because the dust, as they're saying, can make it hard to play back these things. It can make the sound quality low, and it can even make it unplayable. So you want to make sure you've got some good containers. Then it's even going to tell you how to store them. It's going to say for cassette tapes, it's best to stand them up on end. You don't want to lay them flat. You don't want to stack a bunch of them together. If you can, you want to stand them up on end like they're little tiny books.
Oh, okay.
And it's going to talk a little bit about how to play them as well. We're going to talk later on about some options for these obsolete or becoming obsolete media formats. What kind of options do you have in terms of saving them for the long term? Because a cassette tape wasn't made to last forever. It's not going to last forever. So that's another problem too. But in terms of storing the thing to give yourself some time to work with it, this is a really useful resource. So for those tapes, Beverly, if you've got a cooler, darker, kind of constant temperature part of your home where they could live, and if they're all in their nice cases, and you can keep them as free from dust as possible, and if you're able to stack them, or excuse me, not stack them, stand them up on end in a row, kind of like a little bookshelf, that would be ideal.
Okay.
Now, all of that may or may not be possible, but if you can do at least several of those things, that's going to help the tapes. In terms of how to preserve the content on those tapes, that will come back to a little bit later on in our discussion. But in terms of preserving the physical tape to give yourself time to worry about everything else, these are some key steps, as many of them as you can, as are reasonable to do in your situation. So you're welcome. So this is a good resource, this University of Illinois one, for all kinds of resources. You'll see if you read through this and you thought, nope, what I have isn't actually cassette tapes, I was wrong. 8 tracks are right here. You can just keep scrolling through the format and say, oh, yep, maybe this looks like what I have. So I like this resource a lot. I think it's a really good one, and it does tell you for each individual format, what is that ideal storage environment. Some of them are pretty similar. 8 tracks and cassette tapes are both essentially tape in a similar kind of plastic. So theirs are going to be the same, but it does vary from format to format. So it's always good to check on your specific formats.
Okay.
We will.
Beverly, did that help?
It really did, because I have them all in a big paper box. I must have about 60 or 70 of my mother's recordings, and then I have a whole bunch of just random ones in the other room in my office. But I really wanted to keep my mother's because she's passed on about 10 years ago, and I didn't know that I had them. Just been in a box.
Wow. Okay.
So I'm going to share them with my family, but try to preserve them.
Well, we gave you a lot of information, but please follow up with us if you run into any other difficulties and have more questions.
Okay, thank you.
Jenna, I've got another chat question.
Sure.
I have 8mm and 16mm film. What should they be transferred to?
Okay, so this is getting close to Beverly's question, or Beverly, I don't know if you asked it. I might have asked it. Question about how do we get the content off of these things and transfer them to something else.
Yeah.
That for both of these formats, for tape and for film, is something that we'll talk about in a few minutes, you have some options. Now, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting, was this 8mm and 16mm film?
Yes.
Okay. One of the nice things actually about film is that in some ways it's a little more durable than these other formats we've been talking about. Film, in many ways, if you can keep it in a nice environment, which we can go back and look at the environment for film here. So here's our film section. If you look at an 8mm here, it's going to say your storage environment for film ideally is much colder. Ideally, it's 0 to 32 degrees, acceptable 33 to 54. Now, caveat on this 0 to 32, don't just stick your film in your freezer because the problem you're going to encounter there is moisture, right? So if you were to just put your film in your freezer, that water would condense on it and it would make your film wet. So you don't want to do that. But if you read farther through here, it will give you some options. Anyway, film is a little bit more stable than tape is in a lot of instances. So if you can keep it in a good environment, it's going to last a little bit longer. That being said, I realize if what you're trying to do is watch the thing, that's not going to help you too much because film projectors are probably even much more difficult to find than a cassette tape player. In terms of transferring your film, and we'll talk again about this a little bit later too, but there are good options. There are many vendors that will transfer your film for you to digital formats. And digital is probably the way to go these days with transferring your film, ideally to a digital file format rather than to a DVD. From a digital file format, you can always make a DVD if you want to be able to watch it on a television, for instance, that only has a DVD player. You can do that from a digital file, but the digital files are going to preserve better than the DVDs. DVDs themselves don't have a very long shelf life. So if you can transfer something to a better digital file, and then, and this we're going to talk a lot more about, you have to worry about preserving the digital file. So we'll get to that and what that looks like. But there are vendors out there that are happy to do this for you. That's probably the easiest way to go and the most straightforward, best in order of watching it. Then you don't have to try and get the transferring equipment yourself. That would be a lot of work for an 8mm or 16mm film. I would go with a good vendor, and there are many of them. The other thing you could consider if what you're doing is really long-term preservation, you don't want to be able to watch it. There are types of film themselves that are actually intended for really long-term preservation that are very stable polyester film. This is something that is done in rare instances. If it's something that you're really concerned about preserving as film, that's something you could look into. But I would say that's probably not what you need. Probably a conversion to a good, high-quality digital format is going to be the best option. And we're going to talk a little bit about digitizing later on, and we'll talk about some questions to ask, some things to think about when you're considering digitizing. But for both film and for tapes and cassettes, for a lot of this obsolete media, digitization is becoming a really, well, is at this point, a really good option. There's some things to think about what that means and some new problems that creates, but it is the best option.
Okay.
Any other questions at this point?
I'm going to ask later on, where should I purchase this kind of stuff for storage, where the best place is?
We will give you some answers to that one too.
Okay.
Or some ideas at least. So,
Thanks.
You're welcome. So, moving on from our environment then, let's talk a little bit more about the materials. We've started to talk about this, and that University of Illinois guide was showing some information about materials. If you remember, it was saying that inert plastic cases would be the best for those audio cassettes. Materials is a big topic, and I'd like to break it down into kind of big things to consider and then get a little bit more specific, and we're happy to take some specific questions too. We will answer that one about photo separation. Some big things first though. basic guidelines to follow. Whatever materials you're using, you want them to be clean and you want them to be sturdy. We've talked a fair amount already about the problems of dirt, so I won't talk about that anymore. But make sure that whatever you're putting your materials in really is a sturdy, dependable container. You don't want it to have broken handles. You don't want it to be at risk of the bottom falling out, especially after you spend all that time organizing it and making it so wonderful. You want to make sure it will be sturdy. Then make sure whatever you're putting your records in, it isn't too full and it isn't too empty. First one probably is fairly self-explanatory. You want to make sure that there's room to get things in and out. But the second one is equally important, especially when you're dealing with paper records. You see this box here has all those folders standing up in it. If we were to take out half of these folders, all of the others would slump. And over time, what you'd end up with is curled paper. That's important in this scenario, but it can also be important for other types of media as well. If things are moving around too much inside of their containers, especially for certain kinds of media, that can be problematic. If we go back to those 8mm, 16mm films, if they're moving around too much or they're in a container that isn't the right size for them, they might end up warped and you might have problems replaying them, or digitizing them in the future. So just make sure that your containers fit your records to the best of your ability, or if they don't, if you only have enough folders to fill up half of this box, then make sure that you're filling the rest of it with something, whether that's just crunching up some good paper to stick behind those folders so that those folders are able to stand upright. Finally, the big guiding principle for storing records of any kind is don't do anything that can't be undone. We really want to maintain our options. If something isn't working right, then we want to be able to change it, or we want to be able to rehouse it in the future and to keep using it for as long as we can. Couple of things to avoid. Avoid lamination. This might seem counterintuitive. The idea of laminating an object is to preserve it for the long term, to make it more useful, to protect it, right? Lamination, unfortunately, doesn't really do that. Lamination adheres the plastic to your, in most cases, paper item that will over time destroy it, and you can't undo that lamination. So if you have laminated things, right now, don't worry about it. Don't try to undo it. But in the future, don't laminate things. It's one of those things we just can't undo. Also, avoid adhesives. By this, I mean any kind of glue, any kind of tape, anything sticky really is best to avoid. There are some scenarios where you may need them, but I would say those are very, very few and far between. And I would be very cautious of any kind of adhesive that markets itself as archival. There are archival adhesives, but they're generally for very specific uses for those situations where you really just can't avoid an adhesive. And I would say most of the time that isn't the situation that we're in with our records. So if something has a tear and you are worried about that tear expanding, you have some options beyond adhesives. One good option is just to put it in a nice sturdy folder with the tear or in a couple pieces, whichever the case may be, and to store it that way. Another option is there are some good inert plastic, so plastic that's not going to hurt your item, some kinds of mylar sleeves that you could put the item in that sort of a sleeve. That would be another option. But if you can avoid any kind of sticky anything, all the better. If you've probably all encountered a document from, even now from the 70s or 80s, that has some Scotch tape on it, the Scotch tape gets kind of dry and old and comes off and you're left with this weird residue underneath it. We're trying to avoid that. Or potentially even a worse version where that tape just gets old and really sticky. So please, to the extent you can, avoid all adhesives and try and come up with other solutions that, again, can be undone. It's pretty hard to undo most types of adhesive. So those are our big guiding principles. Let's get into something a little more specific in terms of materials. One type of material that you can consider are high quality or archival materials. On the handout that I sent with the slides and the link for today's class, there is a list of archival suppliers on the second page of that. I think there's about 5 or 6 of them. These are a few of the biggest names in archival supplies. They are by no means the only names in archival supplies, but they're a good place to start. They're where a lot of archivists buy their supplies, so you can look through and get an idea for at least the sorts of things that they're saying about their supplies, what kind of qualities the supplies have, that then if you choose to buy them there, great. Otherwise, maybe you choose to buy them somewhere else. Now you know what sort of qualities those supplies should have to be this kind of archival standard. One thing that you may see a lot of are the terms acid-free and buffered when it comes to supplies. This is particularly true with paper. You're going to see paper that, or folders or boxes, anything kind of paper or cardboard based, that is going to say it's acid-free and or it's buffered. And I want to just tell you a little bit about what this means in case they're new terms for you. So acid-free, what does this mean? This means paper that has a pH of about 7 or greater. What that means is that it doesn't have the residues of acids that are used to break up wood in the paper making process. So there are acids that are used in that. Acid-free paper doesn't have that. Many papers themselves, because paper is made out of wood, will become acidic over time. Why do we care about this? What do I even mean by acidic paper? The best example is if you think of newspaper. If you think of a newspaper that's 10, 20 years old, starts to get really yellow, starts to get kind of brittle and break, that's because of the acidity of the paper. Newsprint is especially acidic paper. Most paper would take a very, very long time to get to looking anything like that. But that's the acidity in paper. So over time, that acidity can break down the paper, and it can destroy your record in the long run. So acid-free is good, but acid-free alone doesn't necessarily mean it will be acid-free forever because of the acids involved just in paper making in general, in wood itself. It may eventually develop some acidic properties. Buffered, this other quality of paper, means you're starting from acid-free, but then they actually add a substance to the paper, a buffering agent, which is normally calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate. Don't need to know that. And what that agent does is it counteracts the paper's own acidity. So it's meant to kind of work against that natural acidity of a paper and prevent that paper from aging and eventually yellowing. It can also, the other benefit of buffered paper is that it can counteract the acidity of the things that are next to it. So if you have some records, some older paper or some especially newsprint or some paper that you notice is yellowing, that paper may especially benefit from an acid-free and buffered folder. Or it might benefit from having a piece of acid-free or buffered paper put next to it within a folder to kind of leach some of that acid. So it'll do two things. It'll help that piece of paper, that acidic paper, last a little bit longer just by being in that enclosure, but it will also protect the papers next to it. If you've ever put a piece of old newsprint on top of just a piece of white printer paper and left it there for a decade or so, you know when you come back to it, you've got that outline of the newspaper clipping on your white paper. It's bled onto it from the acidity of that paper. If you were to put a piece of buffered paper in between there, it would buffer it. It would stop that acid from leaching through into your other record. So if you're dealing with some older paper or some paper that seems like it's just not very good quality, those are especially going to benefit from buffered containers, especially buffered folders, buffered paper, buffered something next to it. As I mentioned, these things are available from archival suppliers, also available from other sources, so something you can look out for. If they say, are they acid-free, are they buffered, what do they say about that when you're looking for folders or for paper products? Note of caution about archival supplies, though. not everything that an archival supplier sells is necessarily good for your records. Different archives have different needs, different records have different needs. So just because it's sold doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to fit your situation. Really good example of this, like I was talking about a minute ago, are those archival tapes. They do exist, but for most scenarios, I wouldn't recommend them, especially if you can avoid them. So just keep that in mind. Good to know what's out there, but may not be the best thing for your particular scenario. If those archival supplies are out of your price range, or at least they're out of your price range for some things, that's okay. There are other good options. Remember, the most important principle is just not to hurt your records. So as long as you're just not doing any harm to them, not doing anything that can't be undone, there's some other good options out there. You can find sturdy, good boxes from a general office supplier. Make sure that you're choosing sturdy containers, like I said, boxes and folders. If you are going to use sort of general non-archival supplies, try to avoid anything that has dyes or that has permanent inks. So for instance, if you're buying if you're buying non-archival folders to put documents in, try to buy just the plain manila ones. Don't buy the hot pink ones. Hot pink ones are nice, but they have that potential for that dye that's in them to eventually leach into your records, or goodness forbid they get wet. Maybe it would leak. So try to avoid those. As a general rule, just avoid any kind of permanent ink. I have pencils listed here as a budget option, but really they're just the best option and they happen to be affordable. So use pencils. That's what we use to write on all of our folders. They're a great option. And again, you can undo it. They've got that nice undoing ability to them. To the extent possible, try not to write on your actual records, but you may sometimes need to. You may need to make a note on the back of your record in pencil. Completely understandable. Sometimes it's really useful. I do it if I have a flyer that just says, join us on June 27th. I will write in on the bottom or on the back, normally in some square brackets, June 7th, 1992, to help those people in the future that are trying to figure out when is this thing from. And then just a couple other notes. Make sure if you're putting things in boxes that you're labeling your boxes. On the outside of your boxes, you can use other things to label. You can use permanent markers if that's what you choose to do. Again, if you can get a kind that is pretty unlikely to bleed, that's great. You can also use just regular mailing labels on the outside of your boxes. It isn't touching your records. It's a couple layers removed from your records. I wouldn't worry too much about using just general labels. Archival suppliers will sell you labels, and they're fantastic labels, and they're acid-free, and they will stick better. And if you have the budget for them, great. If you don't have the budget for them, I think the regular ones work just fine. That's because, again, they're a couple layers away from your record. The things that are closest to your record are probably the things you want to pay the closest attention to. And if you have a little extra money, maybe they're a good place to buy some higher quality materials for the stuff that's right next to your archival material. Speaking of somewhere that's a good place to spend a little extra money, if you have it, photo, AV, and special formats. The same things that require a little bit more attention with environment can also benefit all the more from high quality materials. Like I mentioned before, this does kind of go with environment. If you're able to maintain a superior environment, the quality of your materials becomes a little less important. If you're not able to maintain that wonderful environment, which for some of these formats is probably the case, they have a lot of special needs and special requirements to their care, then the materials become all the more important. That University of Illinois guide I've linked again here. I really think it's a good one. And they, as we looked at before, give some recommendations for storage material type for different types of formats. One thing I do want to mention though, because it's already come up and it's such a big part of so many of our collections, is photographs. How do we store photographs? What are some things to consider when storing photographs? One of the things that you will see As you start to look for photo enclosures and for things to care for your photos, is this photographic activity test, or PAT test. This can be a really useful guide to materials that are suitable for your photo collections. So I want to tell you a little bit about what this means, because you'll probably start to encounter it as you're shopping for materials. I want to let you know what it means, also what it doesn't mean, so that you can kind of gauge whether you should buy these materials or whether they'll fit your need. So the PAT test is an international ISO standard for photo-safe materials. Suppliers who make materials, so whether they're folders or paper or sleeves or photo albums, whatever the case may be, they can have their materials tested to see if they pass this PAT test. There are actually two PAT tests. There's one for black and white images and there's one for color images, because you guessed it, they have slightly different needs for their care. Materials that pass the PAT test are shown to not cause the image to fade. So if you put your photograph, your black and white photograph, in a photo sleeve that has passed the PAT test, over time that sleeve should not cause the image to fade from your photograph, nor should it cause the support. So the paper your photograph is printed on, kind of that backing, it's normally paper, sometimes it's more of a plastic, that backing to the image. It shouldn't cause that to yellow. So a folder or a sleeve that's passed the PAT test won't cause the image of your photograph to fade, and it won't cause the backing of your photograph or the support of your photograph to yellow. Materials that have passed the PAT test will normally say they have passed the PAT test. For one simple reason, the main reason you even have your material tested for the PAT test is so that you can say you've passed the PAT test. The suppliers have to pay for this test to be conducted. So it's to their best advantage to market it, to market that they have this extra added thing that they can claim. The PAT test is not a be-all and end-all test, but it's better than nothing. If you know a material has passed the PAT test, that does tell you, okay, it's not going to make the image fade, it's not going to make the support fade. Those are good things. We had a question already about photo supplies and how best to store your photos. There are a number of different answers to this. In some ways, it's easiest to say what not to do. What you for sure don't want to do, or if you can undo it, is those sticky photograph albums that were popular from, well, like the 70s, 80s to, well, I think you can still buy them. The kind where looks like a 3-ring binder most of the time. It has a piece of paper with some sort of adhesive on it, and then like a plastic cover that you open up. You put your pictures down, arrange them as you like, you put the plastic cover back on. Those are best to avoid, again, for the reason we've already talked about, because of the adhesives. Those adhesives, over time, you won't be able to get those photo albums open, and you won't be able to get the photos out of them. So those are best to avoid. In terms of good ways to store your photos, there's a few good options. You can store them in folders. Folders are a great option. If you are able to store them in an archival folder, all the better. You can then interleave the individual images with acid-free paper. Buffered paper is good. Buffered paper is especially good if they're black and white photos. Color photos, depending on the type of color photo, can get a little bit, opinions can differ a little bit more on whether buffered paper is good for them or not. It's sort of an open issue in archives. The University of Illinois guide is going to be really a good one. There's also another guide that I included on your handout that I don't think I have linked in this presentation, but it is on the handout. And that one is called Graphics Atlas. That's put out by the Image Permanence Institute, maybe? Institute for Image Permanence, something like that. They are the folks who help to oversee the PAT test. And the Graphics Atlas is a wonderful identification resource. It gives you some really good ways to figure out what kind of photograph you have. Especially in the early days of photography and sort of the middle days of photography, there were lots of different photographic methods, lots of different ways of printing and ways of taking photos. And some of them have unique needs or benefit from special kinds of care. So if you're dealing with something that just looks different than the rest of your photos, that's a really good resource that can help you to figure out what it is. And between Graphics Atlas and this University of Illinois guide, you can figure out the best ways to care for it. So one option, folder your photos, interleave them with either buffered or non-buffered paper, acid-free paper, archival paper. Or if you can't afford the archival paper and you're in a pretty good non-humid environment, you could just not interleave them. You could just have photo next to photo. You don't want to do that if you're risking an especially humid environment where the photos might end up sticking together. Or if you've taken them out of a sticky album and they have sticky stuff on the back of them, then make sure you've got something in between your photos. Another option that's a good one, especially if you're going to be looking through the photos more often, is to sleeve them in some way. So foldering works great, but one of the downsides of foldering is that if you're going to look through your pictures, you're going to have to touch your pictures, either with your fingers or with gloved hands, and the oils from your skin over the long run aren't good for your pictures either. So if you're not going to look at them that often, foldering is great. If you plan to look through them more often, sleeving is a really good option. And there are sleeves that pass the PAT test. There are a few different kinds of plastic that will pass the PAT test. You can get those either in individual sleeves and then again store the images in folders, or you can get them in albums and store the images in albums. So if you're going to be looking through them more often or having other people looking through them more often, then sleeving might be a better option. We have covered a lot of information about physical preservation of materials. We haven't even gotten to digital yet. We'll do that in a minute. But before we talk about digital, are there questions about physical preservation of materials?
Hello?
Yes. Do you have a question?
I have all of these pictures from different generations. Like I've got, I think, 6 generations worth of pictures, and they're all in different kind of things. Can I like put them together when I do sort them by type, or should I sort them by whose family it is? They're all my family, but I've got like more than 6 totes full of pictures.
Oh my, that's a big photo project.
I have a lot. They're all in the closet in like 4 totes in one place and 3 in the other.
I would say you can sort them in any way that makes the most sense to you. In terms of preservation, you may want to, if it seems doable or seems reasonable, you may want to sort somewhat based on type of photo, just because color photos and black and white photos deteriorate at different rates. So that might be something to consider. Or if you're dealing with that many generations of photos, if you have some photos that are just really different, if you have tin types or you have photos that are on really different kinds of supports, you might want to package those a little bit more carefully than like your black and white photos from the 70s don't need quite as much care in some ways. So that's one thing. In terms of organizing them though, that I would say whatever makes the most sense to you or to others looking through the photos, whether that's your family, or if you're considering donating them to an archive, which we'll talk about a little bit later too, that would be a great question to talk with the archivist. So if they're local to Hennepin County and you think maybe the library would be a good home for them, I'm happy to have that conversation. We can talk more about that. Or if there's somewhere else you think might be a good place, it's always good to talk to the archivist, who may eventually get them someday. Then the two of you can be on the same page. And if they have a certain way they like things organized, then you can kind of get a jump start on that for them.
I would like to digitize them too.
Sure, yeah. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. One thing I would say is, if you are able, write on the back of the photos, if it hasn't already been done, who they are. This is a great thing to do with pencil. Again, I realize some of the more modern photos, especially with the more plasticky backings, it's hard to write with pencil, or pencil just will not write on them. If you're encountering that, there are a couple of options. One option is to use pen. Write softly. You don't want to push through the photo, but you could write softly with pen. Otherwise, another option that we use is colored pencil. There is a particular kind of art colored pencil that writes pretty well on plastic backed photos, so that could be an option too. But, and I can, if that's something that's of interest, I can send out a link to what kind of pencil that is. We use it's actually labeled non-photo blue, which has nothing to do with it not being for photographs. It just means it's not supposed to show up on photocopiers.
I would like that.
Yeah, I can mail that out after the class with these slides and everything again. That pencil type is a good option. Even that won't write on everything. You get some of those really, really plasticky photos, kind of like those Polaroids are pretty bad, or some of those other just really plastic photos. In those cases, pen may be your only option. That's okay. I mean, if you're able to get the information on the photo, people in the future will thank you very much for that. As much information as you know about photos, and this goes for digital photos too. Just if you're able, please put information on your photos about who's in them, when they are, where they are. Those sorts of things are much appreciated. Are there any other questions coming in about physical preservation?
Doesn't look like it, Jenna.
All right.
Unless Beverly has another question.
Did you have another question, Beverly?
No, I just said it's a quiet group.
All right. Well, if you think of some more questions, we can always come back to this. So keep writing them in there if you come up with them. We're going to move on to digital and talk about digital preservation. So the first rule of preserving your digital content, and by this I mean really anything that lives on a computer or on computer format, file format of some kind, the first rule is locks. Lots of copies keep stuff safe, is what that is an abbreviation for. Multiple copies stored in multiple places is the best method of making sure that the stuff lasts for the long term. There are lots of options for this, including free options. There are cloud-based options. I've listed a few of the free ones here. There are also local backup options, external hard drives, your physical computers. Make sure that you have your content in a few different places. One of the real benefits of digital content over physical content is that with digital records, there isn't really one original. We don't have to worry about this being the only copy of something. You can have several originals. So we can use that to our advantage, and we really should. Let's keep lots of copies of things, store them in multiple places, and then we don't have to worry about a computer dying and everything being lost. A couple of other big things to think about. Use common file formats for your records as you're creating things digitally, whether that means making a new document or whether that means digitizing something. Use a common format. I've listed a few here. Microsoft Office formats, so your Word, Excel, PowerPoint, those sorts of things. PDF formats. And then for photos, two of the most common ones are a TIFF format and a JPEG format. We'll talk a little bit about the differences there in a bit. But whatever formats you're using, just try to use really common ones. The reason for doing this is you want to be able to open your records a long time in the future. And if you are using a common enough file format, so say you're using Word, when Word inevitably migrates to a new sort of format, or when people start using a new sort of format instead of Word, Word is so heavily used that there will be a lot of people with a lot of Word documents that they need to move to these new formats. And you can rely on their expertise and the solutions they come up with in order to move your material from Word to whatever the new format becomes. If you are using an app that only you use, maybe it's just a really fantastic app, but it has a really small following, then you are dependent on yourself or one of the people in that small following to create a way to migrate your data out of that app. And that's just less likely. So if you use common file formats, odds are you'll still be able to open this stuff years down the line. Along with that theme, use a good file and folder naming system. Make sure that you know what they mean from whatever the file folder name is. Hopefully it should be clear what's in it. And then keep it simple, keep it consistent, keep it short, and don't use any weird characters. So try to avoid, and some of them your system probably won't even let you use, but try to avoid punctuation and special characters as much as possible in your file and folder titles, just because they may cause problems in the future as well. And likewise, I mentioned this shortly, but I'll make it longer. Keep your file folders and your file names short, because some programs have difficulty with long names, or they cap you out at a certain number of characters. And if you move stuff into another folder, you may go over that number of characters. So we are all imperfect at this. I certainly don't follow all of this all the time, but especially about material that you're viewing as archival, things that you're going to want to keep for the long term. Make sure you have a system in place that will follow these sorts of ideas. So finally, make sure you have an archival system in place for your file system online, or in your digital environment, excuse me. This is part of what we talked about last week. If you were here, that appraisal and selection process, deciding what kind of stuff you want to keep. As you're doing that, create folders or create sections of your storage environment that are clearly marked as archival. Maybe it's a particular drive, maybe it's a particular set of folders within your system, but mark them for long-term preservation so that you and anybody else who works for the organization in the future, anyone looking at these files, will know, oh, okay, this stuff is not supposed to be deleted. This is supposed to be kept long-term. This is archival. Along with that, again, a flashback to last week, all of those inventory processes that we mentioned last week apply to digital too. So as you're creating these digital archival file folders, make a note in your inventory of them, make an extra inventory of them that lives with them in your digital environments. But keep some nice records of what sort of stuff is where in your digital environment so that it's as easy to navigate as all of your physical records. A few big final things to think about then on your digital files. First question to consider is, where can you save things? Where as an organization can we save things? There are lots of options and lots of things to think about here. So I mentioned servers. If your organization has internal server storage, great. You might not. If you have cloud storage, great. Maybe you have a paid subscription for your organization. Maybe you're making use of free ones. Google Drive, Dropbox, these can work wonderfully. Hard drives, external hard drives also work great too. If you're using something like an external hard drive or even multiple computers backing up on the hard drives of multiple computers, consider where you might be able to keep those in physically different places. Maybe one's kept at the office. Maybe one's kept at a board member's house. Maybe somebody has a fireproof safe that you can store a hard drive in. There's lots of good possibilities here, but if you can keep them in physically different locations, that's always good too. Goodness forbid there's a fire or a flood or something at your organization's office, you'll have a backup copy at a different location. So if you have that option, it's a great thing to do. If you do use that option of physically storing copies at different locations, do make sure that you are periodically updating them. So if you have a hard drive at a board member's house, make sure that you've got a notation that however often your organization decides, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly, whatever the case may be, you're going over, getting that hard drive, copying all the new stuff to it and taking it back to where it lives. This is also true, this backup process, by the way, for any of these options. So even if you're using a cloud-based system, make sure that you have it in your itinerary, in your calendar, however often, to do those backups and to make sure that it really is a true copy in both places. One note, extra note to this, if you're using, say, a cloud-based service as your main collaborative environment for your daily work, so you have, maybe it's Dropbox for your organization, and that's what you're working from every day, that's where everything is. Make sure that you also have an archival copy that doesn't live in Dropbox, so that someone can't accidentally go in and delete your archival content out of your Dropbox or change it just in the course of their daily work without realizing they're changing it, and maybe it isn't realized for a while. So you want kind of like a dark backup, the kind that you just don't touch very often, except when you're copying your content to it, to make sure that you've got just that extra copy over there in case something happens. Remember, we're going back to locks, right? Lots of copies keep stuff safe. Another big thing to think about, who has access to your digital content? If you are using cloud-based programs or you're using different email accounts or different web accounts, social media accounts for your organization, who knows the passwords to those? Are they saved somewhere? What if something were to happen, again, goodness forbid, to one of your members who knows that information? Does somebody else know it? Would they be able to access those resources? You may want to consider a password manager or some kind of a system for your shared account passwords and your shared accounts and your shared passwords. There are lots of good password management softwares out there. Each has their own pros and cons, but it would be something to consider potentially, or at least some sort of a system for your organization for passing on passwords from one person to the next and making sure that enough people know them that you won't end up in a situation of no one knowing them. Finally, consider where your important files are. Where are our important digital files? They may not be in your computer's traditional file structure. Some of them probably are there, but they might be in other places too. Where does most of your organization's business happen? Are you using email a lot? Maybe stuff isn't really stored in documents, things are sent back and forth via email. Are you using social media a lot? Maybe that's where you're posting your meeting minutes, or that's where you're posting information about your events, and that's where it lives. Is it on your website? All of these things can be archived or backed up. Depending on the type of service that you're using, there will be different options. Most of them have some kind of internal backup or archive. Most email software does, most social media software does. That might be something to consider doing, or at least look into what the options are for that. I'd like to go a little bit more into that, some of those options for the things that don't live in your computer's file structure. First, like I said, social media and email. A lot of us are using these a lot in our organizations. If you do an online search for your email provider or your social media provider, it should give you some options for how to archive or back up that content. A very few, don't have this option. Probably the most popular among those, unless this has changed in the last couple months, but I don't think it has, is Yahoo. But most other email systems and social media systems will have at least some kind of a backup. It's worth trying, it's worth looking at what this does. It may not save everything you wanted to save. So it's worth trying it to see, what is this really capturing? Is this what I wanted it to capture? If it isn't, we might have some other options. So try that internal backup, see what that does. If you're not having luck with these internal backups of your email or of your social media, You can always go the old-fashioned method and either print content. If you have important emails, there's nothing wrong with just printing out the really important emails and sticking them in a file that goes and lives with the rest of your physical archival records. That is entirely legitimate. Or you can also print to PDFs, save your documents as PDFs, your emails or screenshots. That can work too, and then they would live somewhere in your digital file structure. But those are perfectly legitimate options. There's nothing wrong with them if that is the best option for your organization to just print out some of that important stuff. If you don't want to go with the printing out method, or that isn't going to fit your needs and those internal backups aren't going to fit your needs, there are a couple of other ways to archive the web. These are most useful, in my opinion, if you have an organizational website where you store a lot of your content. So maybe the best place to get all of your meeting minutes or all of your newsletters is through your website. That's really where they live. Maybe they live internally on Google Drive or on your network for a couple of years, but on your website they go back much farther and nobody's really quite sure where they ever came from, but they're up on the website. If that's the case, then you might want to archive your website. I've listed a couple options here for ways to do that. The first one is the Internet Archive Wayback Machine. You may have heard of this. If you haven't heard of it, I encourage you sometime after class to go to this link here and try it out. It's kind of fun. Basically what it is archived copies of websites going back to the 1990s. This Internet Archive crawls the web and captures websites at various intervals. It isn't really standardized. And then you can go and view what a website looked like at a particular point in time. There is an option through the Internet Archive to archive your website now. You can click a button and say, I want to capture my website as it looks right now. You copy paste your website URL into their machine and you say capture now, and it will capture it right then, and it will be archived in the Internet Archive. So if you have a single page, maybe your main homepage has something really important on it right now, you can capture it this way. You don't have to worry about storing it. It will be stored by the Internet Archive in their archive, and you can go back and see it anytime you need to. You can even get a URL that will link directly to that archived version of the website. So no matter what changes you make to your live website, this archived version will continue to exist in the Internet Archive. The downside to this is that it will only capture that single page. So it will capture your homepage if you've just made a big change to your homepage, or maybe you're about to make a big change to your homepage, redesign your website, and you want to capture what it used to look like. It will capture that homepage. But if you were to click on a link from your homepage, even say go to the list of your board members, if that's on a different page, it will not have captured that. So that's the downside to this method. You could capture that page, but you'd have to, again, put in that URL into Internet Archive's interface and capture each different website, so each different link on your website. One other option that I want to mention is called Conifer. It's listed here as Web Recorder and Conifer. They used to be combined and now they're kind of separate. They do similar things, and Conifer is the more online cloud-based version. This is a free online, as I mentioned, web archiving program. Basically, you go to Conifer's website, you create an account. It's a free account, up to 5 gigabytes of data. You create this free account, and then it lets you archive your website. You open your website in their browser, and it'll look just like your website normally does, and you just click on all the links you want to click on, and every page that you open in Conifer will be archived. So you can click through every link on your web page and it will archive all of that content. You can make this publicly available on the web. You just click, yep, I want this to be public, and it will be public through Conifer's website. Again, you'll have a URL that you can link to if you want to see that old version of the website. You can also download it. It's kind of an obscure file format. It's the file format used for web archives. But you could download that content and have that with your other records that maybe an archive in the future, if you consider donating your records to a repository, would be able to use that. So this is especially good if your organization is going to undergo a really big change of their website. You're completely changing it and you want to capture everything that was on the website before you do that. Conifer might be a really good option for that. It can also be a good option for trying some of those social media captures. If you weren't able to get what you wanted by backing up your social media, you might be able to get it by web archiving. A word of caution, social media is notoriously hard to web archive, so it may or may not work the way you want it to, but it might be worth a try with this free software. What questions do you have about digital records? Well, we're not entirely done with them. They'll come up again a little bit later. So if you do have any questions, raise your hand, throw them in the comments, let me know. In the meantime, we will go on to talking about accessing and promoting records, our second big question for tonight. And this one has less to cover in some ways than the last one, so we should still be fine on time. You have all this stuff. How are you going to let the public and your organization know about it? How are you going to let people use it? The first and probably most obvious method is physical access. People can physically come look at the stuff. Few key considerations as you're contemplating physical access to material. First, who's going to have access to this stuff? Can anybody from the public use this material, or is some of it confined just to people in my organization? Maybe there's some material that we don't want to be publicly known at this point, maybe somewhere down the line. That's something to consider. Who will have access? Second, where and how will people have access? Will this material be available just in our organization's office? Or will people be able to take material home with them? Maybe people from our own organization. Is there a particular room in our office where things have to be used? What will that look like? I encourage you, if you are having people removing things from a particular room, or even just people accessing things, it's a good idea to track this somehow. Maybe just keep a log of who was here or what they looked at, or when they returned it, so that you know if you're looking for something where it went. After you spent all that time last week making those wonderful inventories, you want to make sure they still apply, right? So you want stuff to end up back where it was when you inventoried it. Otherwise, all of your work was for naught. So some kind of a log might be helpful. Another great method for physical access is pop-ups and exhibits of your material. So by a pop-up, what I mean is if you're going to an event as an organization, maybe you take some of your archive stuff with you. Maybe you make a neat little display that people can interact with. Maybe inside your own offices, you make a little display people can interact with. You can use reproductions for a lot of this. You see the display at the bottom of this slide here. Pretty much everything you see there is a reproduction. It's copies of our photos. It's copies of our city directories. So you could even use copies, then you don't have to worry about people touching them or worry about whether, goodness forbid, they walk away or something. If it's a copy, it really doesn't matter all that much. So that's something that's a wonderful idea. Or exhibits. If you have a space in your office, or maybe in a partner organization has a space where you can put up some information about your organization, use your archival content. It's great stuff. People love it. Just make sure when it's all said and done that everything gets back where you got it from, so that your inventories are still accurate. Another option for access is digitally. Some of this we've covered already, but now we're thinking about it more from an access perspective. So who has passwords to your accounts? How can you let people access stuff in your accounts? What would that look like? How would that work? Who will be able to add and delete things within your accounts? Again, wanting to make sure that you keep the things that you've labeled as archival. How will that work? Are there some digital systems you can put up around that? There might be, depending on what platforms you're using. Then think about how you'll share stuff digitally. If somebody from from the public or from your organization asks for information, will you email things to them? Will you share it over some kind of a cloud-based system? Will you share things with the public through email or cloud-based system? Any of these can work. It's just really up to your organization what works best for you. And then finally, digitally, think about how your content could be used on your website, on social media, on these other great online platforms. This can be a wonderful way to share your history. Digital files can be shared pretty easily. You can post things on your website, post your annual reports, post your board meetings. You can share photos on Instagram. The majority of the photos that I have used in this presentation come from our own digital collections, and a lot of them have nothing to do with really what I'm using them for in this presentation. This woman working on this very 1980s computer she wasn't doing this for a slide on digital access to archival content. This is just something that seemed kind of applicable. I could use it. It was fun. It helps us remember the history of our organization. In order to do this, to use your content for the web or for social media, you may need to digitize some material. If your material already exists digitally, you don't have to worry about that. If it doesn't, digitization is a really big topic. We are going to scratch the surface of it here, and my goal is really to give you some things to think about and some ways to approach a digitization project, some questions to ask yourself and your organization. And then we'll get a little bit into some practicalities. So if you have more practical questions, by all means, ask them. But first, I want to talk about these kind of big picture things to think about. So,
Jenna, can we shoot in a question all the same?
Sure.
Someone's asking, is it an option for very valuable things to let visitors access them only in a room where staff have brought the object out for viewing?
Sure.
I think she's looking at basically saying where you can't digitize it.
Sure. Yes, that's absolutely an option. I mean, if it's your material, it is entirely up to you how you let people access it. So if it's your own organizational records, you can do as you will. If you're a heritage organization, I know we had some museum folks on the call tonight too. Again, yes, you can absolutely choose to do that. I would encourage you, I don't think I mentioned this explicitly, but to consider, yes, if you're letting the public use your records, probably somebody from your organization should be around to make sure you can answer any questions they have, and to make sure that it's a safe environment, to make sure that all these things we've just talked about, not doing harm to your records somehow inadvertently, that isn't done inadvertently or I suppose maliciously either. So yeah, that's entirely an option, and that's an option that can be a good one for certain things. And certain things, if it's a really valuable object or an object that's not in stellar condition, digitization may not be a good option for that object either. So, which actually is kind of a good segue into what I want to say with digitization. I encourage you to be very thoughtful in your digitization projects. Digitization is wonderful. It's a wonderful means of access, but it's not right for everything. So consider that as you're considering digitization projects. I've listed it here, the first bullet point on this slide, in fact, that digitization is most of the time for access. It's about making things available to people. It's about spreading things wider, letting people know they exist, and kind of contradicting what I just said. If you have an original that isn't in great condition, but a lot of people want to look at it, digitization can be a good way to make it accessible without people having to look at the original. So it really just depends on your individual case. Sometimes digitization can be for preservation. We've already talked about this tonight. Digitization might be for preservation if the original material has a format that's becoming obsolete or is badly damaged. So this could be things like those 16mm films, those VHS tapes, those audio cassette tapes, where the original either has a format that's becoming obsolete and will eventually not be playable anymore or accessible anymore, or where the original is maybe in a state of decay. I mentioned that 16mm film, 8mm film can last a really long time, and that's true, but if it's not in the right environment, it will start to deteriorate. And there might be a window where it's still playable now, Maybe it won't be playable in a year. Maybe we need to do something with it right now. And in that case, digitization can be a good form for preservation. If you find yourself in that sort of scenario, I encourage you to consult with some kind of a professional. On the handout that I included with the slides tonight, I included a list of some resources for preservation of materials. They range from individual centers that focus on preservation to government entities that focus on preservation to that list we already saw from the University of Illinois. Take a look at some of those, talk with some local vendors. If you're working with a particularly rare document, you may even reach out to a preservation specialist of some kind at a local heritage organization or repository that you're working with. If you're dealing with things like film, there are lots of good vendors who may be able to get those scanned for you. Second note here, in most scenarios, keep the originals of whatever you're digitizing. The only exception here is going to be those originals that are really deteriorating, that are really just not playable anymore, and digitization is kind of your last chance to preserve the content. Unless you're in that scenario, preserve the original. Couple of reasons. The original is normally more stable than the digital. For a lot of this stuff, especially if we're talking about photographs, or documents for sure, you can stick them in a box, put them on a shelf, come back in 50 years, and you can still tell what they are. This is not at all true for digital files. Digital files require constant maintenance. This entire locks concept that we were just talking about, you need lots of copies, you need to make sure you're still going to be able to access material. So if you're creating a digital file, as the third bullet point says here, if you're digitizing, you're creating a digital file. You now need to preserve this digital file. If you have the original still, you already have kind of a backup, right? You don't have to worry as much about the preservation of the digital file if you have the original and if the original is still in good condition. So keep those originals. And then once you have the digital files, you got to think about locks. You got to think about those copies, where you can keep them, what that'll look like. The final big thing when it comes to digitization, especially if you're going to be sharing things outside of your organization, is to think about copyright and privacy. These are really big topics. There are lots of laws that apply here. We're not going to get into that tonight. But as a general starting point on this, think about whether there's content in what you're considering digitizing that maybe shouldn't be widely available. Whether that's something like somebody's private information, their social security number, their bank account number, or whether it's their intellectual property, right? Maybe it's photography of a particular individual who hasn't given you permission to put their photographs up online. Those are the sort of things you want to think about. Just, is this the sort of material that should be widely available, if that is my plan when I'm digitizing it, to make it widely available? So those are the big things. I want to talk really, again, kind of at a high level about some of the practical things to consider with digitization. If you decide to do a digitization project, I want to talk about the tools. I want to talk about what kind of things you would be creating, what those digital files you create might be. If you embark on digitization, the biggest tool that you will be using most of the time probably is a scanner of some variety or another. There are lots of kinds of scanners, and the best scanner for your project will really depend on what kind of thing you're scanning. Flatbed scanners are going to be the most versatile kinds of scanners most of the time, but there are all kinds of specialty scanners. There are scanners that are made just for photographs. There are scanners that are made just for particular kinds of media. If you know you have a whole bunch of negatives, there are scanners that specialize in those. Like I said, flatbed are probably the most versatile, and there are all different kinds. There are all kinds of reviews online. You can look up what are some good options for your particular project. There may even be other organizations you can partner with who will rent out scanners to organizations or offer them free to organizations. Cultural heritage institutions sometimes do that. So that's something to consider. So scanners are probably the biggest one, especially photographs, documents. You're going to be working with scanners. If you are dealing with other kinds of media, so these are your film, your tape, those things we've been talking about a lot tonight. There are media converters for these. There are also vendors that specialize in converting and digitizing these materials, all kinds of these materials. There are vendors for documents and photographs as well. If you're considering a media converter, so a player of some kind that you then attach to your computer and it digitizes the content, these can be a good option. They can be affordable. A lot of them will work with existing material. So if you have, say, a cassette tape player that works really well and doesn't eat tapes, that you want to use to digitize your audio cassettes, that's doable. You can get a cord that will connect your cassette tape player into your computer, and it will let you digitize that tape. There are softwares that you can download to your computer to help you with that, software that will create a nice preservation quality copy, a really good copy of your information from your cassette player. If you don't want to embark on this project yourself, you can work with vendors instead. The kinds of materials that you're most likely to be able to convert yourself, if you do decide you want to do that, are the most recent kinds. The older the media gets, the more difficult it gets to convert, just because there aren't enough players around anymore. But if you have VHS tapes, you have audio cassette tapes, you have CDs, fewer and fewer computers have CD players, you have floppy disks, those sorts of things, you may be able to get a converter to plug into your computer. If you decide to outsource to a vendor or partner with a vendor to do the digitization for you, you're still going to have to organize everything and describe everything yourself. So you're still going to have to label everything, figure out what everything is, figure out a way to store everything on your computer. So vendors can be a great partner. It can work really well, especially if you don't have the players or the scanners to do this yourself. But do be aware that they're not going to do everything. You're still going to have to organize things. You're still going to have to label things in a way that will make sense to you and your organization. The last tool I've listed on here is the Minnesota Digital Library. If you're a nonprofit in Minnesota, you might be able to partner with the Minnesota Digital Library. They have programs where they do some digitization for organizations. You will still have to do all of that description and organization that I mentioned, but they would make materials available in their digital collections, which is called Minnesota Reflections. So they might be something worth looking into if you are a nonprofit in Minnesota and you're interested in that option. Let's talk about the kinds of files you're going to create then, this output. There are two main types of files that you can create. You can either create a high resolution, lossless copy for preservation's sake, or you can create a lower resolution, lossy copy for access sake. So for preservation's sake, what you want is the best, highest quality copy of your material. This is going to be especially important if your media is obsolete or if your original is in really bad shape. Those rare situations where you aren't going to be able to save the original. Then you want to make sure you get the highest quality digital output that you can, because it will become your new original, right? It's the only one you'll have. So you need it to be really good. These are going to be big files. They're going to take a lot of storage space. They're going to be lossless. What that means is that they're going to be uncompressed files. There's two main types of files we have. We have uncompressed and we have compressed. Uncompressed files take up more space because compressed files were designed to shrink things down. If you compress it, it's going to be smaller. That's the real advantage of a compressed file. The way they get that, though, is they run a compression algorithm on your content every time you open it or save it. And every time they do that, they lose a little bit of content. Not something you're going to notice. It's not something you notice for, in most cases, a long time, but it is happening each time. And if you are dealing with a preservation master copy, your original item now, you don't want that to be happening every time you open it. So you're going to want a lossless copy. For photographs, that's going to be a TIFF file. That's what I've listed here. For audio files, that's often going to be a WAV file, W-A-V file. There are other types. And there are some good resources you can check, or you can even just search online, is this a lossless file type? And the internet will be able to help you with that. If you're worried just about access, you're not going to consider this a preservation copy. You just want a picture you can put up on social media. You don't really care if the scan lasts a long time. You're okay maybe rescanning it again pretty soon. Then you might be interested in a low resolution or a lossy copy. These can be smaller file sizes. For photos, the most common is a JPEG, but there are others. This is normally what your digital camera on your phone even is taking. It's taking JPEG photos most of the time. These work fine for that sort of access. But again, every time you open it, it is compressing and decompressing, and you're losing a little bit of data. So it's not something that's going to last forever. It's not a good archival format. But for just that access, it can work great. And even if you're creating a preservation copy, even if you're creating this new archival master digital file, those lossless files, you're still probably going to want one of these lossy copies, one of these JPEGs or its equivalent, for easy access. So you can keep your master copy nice and safe, back it up in all your different places, follow your locks, and then from those copies you can make JPEGs. And that's what you can use to post online, that's what you can use to send out to people interested in looking at them. They're a lot smaller, they're a lot easier to open because they're smaller, and they do the job most of the time. They're just not good for that long-term preservation. If all of this sounds like way more than you want to deal with, or sounds like a bigger project than you were hoping for, there's always another option, and that is to consider access through a repository. This is what we do in archives, is access and preservation. At Hennepin County Library, our focus is on local history, so Hennepin County and Minneapolis history. If your organization is from Hennepin County or Minneapolis and you're interested in working with us, donating materials to the library, we'd be happy to chat with you about that. If you're not from around here, or if you're interested in working with a different repository, there are archives in lots of places. Often your public libraries, historical societies, universities, museums will have archival components, and they can be a great resource. If your organization has a particular mission that fits within a larger organization, that larger organization may already have some archival partners. That might be something to check out. There are also archives that focus on particular topics. So I mentioned our focus is generally geographic, but there are some that are more topical. So maybe your material would fit with a particular archive's mission in that way. They might be a good partner. Archives are designed to provide access and to preserve material, and we have professional staff who does this. Like I said, this is our thing. We may include digitization projects in archives. Like I said, our archive has a large digitization project. That's something that if you do decide to go this angle, the angle of working with a repository, talk with them about it. What does it look like in their repository? What's their philosophy on digitization? How would that work with these collections? Make sure you're all on the same page. Just generally speaking, as you're talking with the archivists at your local repository or the repository you're considering partnering with, just ask them lots of questions. We like having questions. Make sure you understand what their policies are. Specifically things about access. How would you access your material in the future? What would that look like? Normally, when you donate materials to an archive, those materials then belong to the archive. So you want to make sure you're donating materials that you're done with. You're not going to need on a daily basis anymore. Maybe you'll need to reference them, or somebody will, to figure out the history of your organization every few years. But it's not the sort of thing you're going to be working with every day. It's the sort of thing that can become a part of our general history, the history of our region, for example. and could be open to all people and really useful in that way. Organizational records are fantastic for that. So if that's the state, or that's the point you're at with some of your records, doesn't have to be everything. Maybe it's just a few boxes that you think we just don't need these anymore. Maybe an archive would be interested in. Chat with us about them. We'd love to talk about that. Ask all kinds of questions about who can access materials, how do you access materials, what does that look like, especially in our current environment. Things are a little different in terms of access. How does that work right now? How will it work again once we reopen more broadly? And then ask about charges. Are there charges associated with the archive? Are there charges for use of material from the archive? Some archives do charge. We at Hennepin County Library never charge for use of our materials, but some do. So you'll want to make sure you understand just all of their policies, how they work. Finally, do not feel like you have to have all of your ducks in a row before you contact a repository. We are happy to work with you wherever you are in your project. We like to be involved in the organization of things, so don't feel like you have to have all of this done. Don't feel like you have to be committed to donating material to an archive. We are happy to answer questions, so please reach out if you think that it's something you might be interested in, or if there's other questions that we can answer. We're wrapping up for the evening. If you're wondering where you go from here, what do you do now that we've covered all of this? I have included a number of what I consider to be really good resources on that handout that I emailed out earlier. And I'll email that and these slides and information about photo pencils out after class. I would encourage you to check out some of those resources on that list. I think they're really good ones. They include local and national archival organizations, local and national preservation organizations. What isn't included there, because it would be specific to your own group, are umbrella organizations for your group. Is your group part of a larger organization, or do you have connections to other organizations? They may have really good resources for you. They might have an archivist. They might have some other organizations who've been interested in these same questions that they can connect you with, and they can be a good resource as well for your specific situation.